So yeah, thank you for the introduction. It's wonderful to be here. Grew up in Dunedin, and I actually went to the Otago Energy Research Centre 10 years ago now. So nice to be back. Yeah, so today I'm going to just talk about kind of some of the Commission's work. This is our vision statement from our corporate documents. And I think it describes kind of what we're trying to do and what the Act asks us to do. So I'll start off with a bit of just a description of what the Climate Commission is and what it isn't. And then I'll take you through some of our advice about mitigation and adaptation. So our role is to provide independent, impartial advice about the choices the government of the day has to respond to climate change. Our independence is intended to assure that all New Zealanders think that there's a credible and well-monitored action towards climate change in New Zealand. And we're sort of not alone as an organisation. There are about 25 other similar bodies around the globe who provide independent advice and monitorings to governments. We were formed alongside the setting of the country's climate targets in November of 2019. And we were legislated as part of the Climate Change Response Zero Carbon Amendment Act. The Act passed at the time with multi-party support. And the Act is really prescriptive, and it tells us what we should give advice on and what we should consider when we do it, and even down to exactly the dates that we should publish our reports. So it's quite prescriptive. So we take pretty much the same approach to a lot of the work that we do. And what we have to consider is, as I said, really clearly laid out in the CCRA. So all of our work is evidence-based. It doesn't just mean quantitative data. We sort of value a whole range of different types of expertise and knowledge, and we draw insight and even from engagement with people on the ground. We consider the Crown Iwi, Crown Māori relationship and Te Ao Māori and its effects on iwi Māori. And we take a systems view, which means we consider how government policy, the economy, and industry, society, and the environment are all connected. And as well as that, we think about the distribution of benefits, costs, risks between current and future generations. We also consider adaptation alongside climate change. Sorry, adaptation to climate change alongside emissions reduction, because I guess robust climate policy needs to account for both. Or one issue to tackle, one action to tackle one could make another problem worse. So here's just a quick run through of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to just run through kind of the governance structure for emissions reductions, our targets and budgets, and then kind of talk about some opportunities that we see for the government to set ambitious budgets. And then I'm going to look at how we're tracking towards the current budgets that the government has set. And so I'm going to talk a bit about, then I'll move on to sort of the adaptation side of things and kind of how we think about climate risk, how risks cascade through, infrastructure networks. And then we'll have some time for some questions. Why is it going backwards? There we go. So this diagram shows our system for reducing emissions. So the target is set in legislation by the government, and that's intended to set a long-term signal and provide a direction of travel. We currently have a split gas target, which means that we consider all gases except for biogenic methane separately. And so we have a net zero target for all gases except biogenic methane, and then the current target for methane is 24 to 47, but the government has announced that they're going to reduce that down to 14 to 24, and that should go through this year. Once we've set the target, we also we've got emissions budgets. They are the stepping stones that take you to that target. And then the emissions reduction plan sets out the cross-sector strategies to reduce emissions and achieve the budgets while supporting people and communities. We basically have a role in advising on the 2050 target, the level of emissions budgets, the direction of policy for emissions reduction plan, as well as monitoring progress towards the set budgets. But ultimately, all the decisions about emissions budgets, emissions reduction plan, and policies they're comprised of are determined by the government of the day, not the Climate Change Commission. We have a role in advising the government, but ultimately, and we also do have a role in monitoring, so we can shine a light on the progress or lack of progress that's being made to achieve the goal. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what the budgets actually are. So the first three green bars here are the budgets that are already set. And at the end of last year, we recommend to the government that they set the fourth emission budget, and that's the level there. And the government was due to set the fourth budget this year, but it's deferred that decision through to 2027 in light of the target change that I mentioned earlier. And it's also worth noting that in our EB4 advice, we recommended a bunch of technical revisions to the existing budgets, and that's basically because there's been changes to the emissions inventory and how emissions are counted. It's made meeting the budgets that were set easier to achieve, and so this is the current level that they're set at, and based on the inventory revisions and a few other technical changes, we think that the budgets should be set here if you maintained that same ambition that was intended when you originally set those first three budgets. And I guess the reason why we made our fourth budget recommendation is it's intended to be ambitious but achievable, and at least in the buildings, energy, and transport sectors, the benefits of transitioning to net zero significantly outweigh the costs. So we've looked in detail into that pathway to achieving the fourth emissions budget period, and doing that through reducing gross emissions. So our analysis shows that investing in decarbonisation in energy and transport will yield significant long-term savings. By 2040, we would save an additional 1.2 billion annually by following the EB4 demonstration path, which is one of the ways to achieve emissions budget 1 to 4. And that saving is in comparison to the reference scenario, which reflects the government's policies as of 2024. There are also pretty big co-benefits, such as reducing social cost of air pollution by around $2 billion by 2050. And we'd also see a significant reduction in foreign expenditure on oil products by about $4 billion by 2050. So that's in comparison to current spending levels. And those savings leave us less exposed to volatile ore markets and shift spending from overseas to domestically produced electrons in general. But to get those benefits, we need to reduce gross emissions rapidly and build out infrastructure to support the transition. So electrification of transport industry and residential and commercial buildings is really a key mechanism for this. And it's also a key driver of the long-term savings, as I said in the previous slide. But it's also going to result in a lot of new demand coming online. So in our scenario, about a third of that demand growth comes from electrifying transport. And yeah, we'll basically need a lot of infrastructure build out to support that. So if we follow our demonstration path, we would see a growth from around current levels of generation, about 44 terawatt hours, up to 70 in 2050. And the Infrastructure Commission did a bit of analysis on our scenarios and estimated that would have a capital investment requirement of about $100 billion through to 2050, which is about 0.6% of GDP. And that's about $24 billion, about a fourth more than the reference scenario. That kind of build out is by no means unprecedented, but it's sort of like roughly equivalent to the level of investment we'd be seeing in the 1980s during the Think Big era. So with sort of the benefits of emissions reductions, which I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody here, set up, I'll talk about how we're tracking towards achieving those goals. So the country's making progress towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're on track to meet the first emissions budget. However, we see a lot of risks, and further action is urgently needed to meet the later emissions budgets. And taking action could bring significant benefits, help strengthen our resilience and ensure that we don't fall behind other countries in terms of progress. So these are government projections now, and they show that the first and second emissions budget between now and 2030 can be met. But for the third, there's emissions are off track with current policy. And as I sort of explained before, our assessment is against current budgets, but these technical revisions mean that we've also recommended revising these emissions budgets down. And if you do that, the government's off track for the second and third budgets much more significantly. So it's possible to meet the third emissions budget and the 2050 target by reducing risk in the session and reduce risk to achieving the second emissions budget. There's a whole lot of actions that we've quantified and looked at that could achieve that. Even if we, account for methodological change. And there's also sort of, lower prices of solar, electric vehicles, and batteries can just accelerate the shift naturally as well. And also, if there's opportunities for the government to support further private sector actor and Māori-led climate action to deliver additional benefits and wider benefits without significant fiscal cost. So a couple of things we've recommended that the government should do to support these is consider a well-signaled evolution of the emissions trading scheme to really drive emissions reductions, and as well as things like integrating planning for urban development and transport infrastructure, optimizing freight movement and for road, rail, and coastal shipping. And also, what I'll talk about now is supporting the uptake of electric vehicles. So fleet transitions are pretty slow, and the average age of a vehicle scrapped is about 20 years. So if this trend continues, vehicles that are entering the fleet now would still be on the road in 2050. EV sales are pretty sluggish at the moment. That's the chart showing them up to last month. And they're about 3% on average in 2025 so far, which is quite a bit. It was, lower than even the government's own projections. And that sort of really slow flatlining uptake rate is posing a risk to really the third emissions budget in particular. So yeah, and I guess the other thing with that is, part of the demand story within that for electricity demand is that growing EV uptake. And if we see that, it's going to continue to undermine the investment that we need in electricity supply. So as I said, we're on track to meet the first budget. There are risks for achieving the second and third budgets, especially if the government makes changes to the budgets to account for improved methodology. There's a big opportunities to accelerate emissions reductions, whilst at the same time reducing costs for both national and household level. Electrification is key to many sectors, whilst beneficial overall, and but it does create new vulnerabilities and resilience challenges. So I'll just talk through a little bit very quickly about sort of the policy cycle that we are regulated under. So the cycle goes, there's every 6 years, there's a national climate change risk assessment, which is a national level assessment. And that risk assessment, the key risks out of that are intended to inform the government's national adaptation plan, which is then cycles through to government policy implementation, action on the ground. And then the Commission has a role in monitoring both the implementation of the National Adaptation Plan and the government's policy implementation. And we do both the National Climate Change Risk Assessment and the Commission and the monitoring. So our role is to assess in the risk assessment, which I'll talk about now, is our role is to assess the risks in the New Zealand economy, society, and environment from the current and future effects of climate change. We also are asked to identify the most significant risks to Aotearoa New Zealand, and based on and then sort of essentially give the government a prioritized list of risks that they need to take coordinated action over in the next 6 years. But just briefly, what are we talking about when we're talking about climate risk? Because I don't think it's necessarily a clearly understood term. So what we hear is when people talk about risk, they think about things like, will my home be underwater, or will the next storm take out a road? and that's sort of part. These are important questions, and the risk assessment should answer them, or should engage with them. But it's not technically a risk, at least for our consideration. These are just all climate hazards, so flooding and yeah. But so a climate hazard is a physical event or trend with potential impact on people, the environment, and the economy. Examples of climate hazard include severe weather, temperature rise, droughts, and sea level rise. Climate risks are related but different. A risk is a potential for adverse consequences for human or ecological systems. Climate risks arise from climate hazards, but when analysing them, like it's about you've got to think. So when there's climate hazards, you've also got to think about who is impacted by those climate hazards and how vulnerable they are. And then also the response to those climate actions can also create other problems. So our task for the National Climate Change Risk Assessment is not to ask how a climate hazard is going to increase over time. It's to ask what is the potential for adverse consequences to Aotearoa New Zealand as a result of those hazards. So just to sort of dash through a few examples of the risks we're looking at. So linear transport networks, road, rail, freshwater ecosystems, social cohesion, so sort of a wider community risk, social cohesion, community, cultural well-being, and then access to tonga, species, kai, are all risks that we're considering for the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. And then how we prioritize these is we look at the risk severity for each of the 30 risks that we're considering. We also look at what the policy readiness is. So how effective is the policy in this space, and and what's planned, and what the gap is that's remaining. So are there any gaps in the policy? We've also done work on kind of how the risks interact with each other. So the potential for one risk to mitigate another. And we also think about, we've done some Te Ao Māori analysis, and all of those things feed into sort of the risk prioritization process and our advice to government. So I'd like to do a little test. Well, it's for me more than anyone here. So this is a description of one of our risks, and I'll show you the criteria in a minute, but I'm just going to ask the audience to score it. So this is the present day risk, and I'll ask you to score it for severity. But this is the risk to electricity and telecommunications infrastructure. We assess these together. The past risk assessments have looked at electricity infrastructure, but no, we hadn't looked at telecommunications infrastructure before, so we've added it in. But this is really focused on electricity infrastructure here. So thinking about the risk, electricity networks are highly exposed to extreme weather, particularly distribution. There's hazards. Extreme weather is a major hazard. And then in transmission, there's also things like, flooding for equipment on the ground, and also wildfire is an emerging risk. In our assessment, we found it had relatively high adaptive capacity. So compared to a lot of other infrastructure types. It was pretty good at dealing with extreme events, and also we're seeing emerging technologies like home batteries that can increase resilience further. As I've sort of said all along, that there's electricity networks become increasingly important, and so there's really strong links to mitigation here. But there's also equity impacts. Remote communities are much more likely to be disproportionately affected by outages and face higher costs potentially. So this is a really dumbed down kind of set of criteria that we use to rate them. It runs from minor, where losses are rare and sort of relatively insignificant, to extreme, where it's pretty catastrophic. So I'm sort of interested if the audience would able to raise their hand if you think this risk would be minor. What about moderate?
Now or future?
Now. Minor? Moderate? Major? Okay. I think major won there. So we have scored it minor for current day. And that's, I mean, these scores are relative. I've included linear transport networks as an example here, but essentially the difference between these two is they're both very exposed to climate hazard, but electricity networks have a much higher adaptive capacity currently than other infrastructure systems, and they're able to get up, and their funding environment is much better. So these things are relative, and these do increase as we go into the future. Notably, I should note that these are all in draft, so we haven't finalized any of these scores yet, but it's a piece of work that we're working on now. So the final thing I'll talk about is cascading risks. This is a piece of analysis we've been doing, and I'll talk through just a really detailed piece of analysis we did on cascading risks between infrastructure networks. So this is a causal loop diagram that tries to distill kind of all of the interactions between infrastructure into a single diagram. There's a lot going on, but basically you take the climate driver here, and it takes it all the way through to impacts on society and governance and our ability to govern, and that sort of loops back through and goes back to our ability to regulate emissions. So just zooming in on one component, this is the infrastructure. Yeah, you see ongoing exposure and vulnerability, which impacts infrastructure condition in the black, flowing on to access to healthy housing, health outcomes, access to food, and connectivity of people. And then that flows into sort of impacting individual and community well-being, reduces social cohesion, and then on reducing or impacting adaptive capacity. And then the purple there is our ability to make democratic decisions, which flows back around and into the top here, as I said. Yeah, so how are we doing? About on time. There are risks to Aotearoa not only from not only from climate impacts, but also from failing to meet the goals we set ourselves. Failing to mitigate emissions could have significant impact on our trade relationships, particularly for partners where we've signed trade deals like the EU or the UK. And failing to adapt also has consequences that go beyond the physical or financial. The Climate Change Commission has a role in monitoring and advising on both adaptation and mitigation. We've got a well-established role in mitigation with about 10 publications over the last 5 years. But we're only really starting our work in adaptation with our first publications coming out last year and the next two due out in 2026. So thank you very much, and I will take questions.
So any questions? Hand up here.
Hi. This on? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Madison Zgear from the Sustainable Energy Research Group at the University of Canterbury. I just had a question on, you discussed about needing to expand the battery electric vehicle fleet as a response, but if we don't have, we kind of need more investment in our electricity supply to do so. So what does the Climate Change Commission recommend in terms of expanding electricity generation?
So I think we've made a number of recommendations. I think fundamentally, like, the government's role is to kind of enable investment. There's some barriers to that, and I think so. I think we have made recommendations about kind of reducing the consenting requirements and that kind of thing. I'm not, I wouldn't say we haven't come out and sort of made specific, explicit like endorsements of current government policy around that. But yeah, that's a key one, I think.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, you can.
So you also classified like the network risk as minor. How would you classify like the generation of electricity supply risk?
Yeah,
in terms of like hydro specifically, of like the dry
hydro
specifically.
So that's the thing to note on these is that they're like quite big. Like that's not, so like we classified generation risk, but we didn't classify hydro risk. So it was also minor, I believe, for current day. But yeah, that meant like, there's quite a big lot of generation in there. And so, yeah, we did think about that hydro specifically as well. But
all right, well, I'll let someone else ask a question, but I might follow up with you in the break, if that's okay?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Catalina. I am from the Sustainable Energy Research Group as well, from the University of Canterbury. And I have a question about like, how do you think the government should deal with the light-duty vehicles? Because it's the most energy-related emission right now. So how do you think the government should address that?
Yeah, I think in terms of light-duty vehicles, I think there's that, there's obviously a couple of things. Reducing demand is a really key one, and the Commission has made a lot of recommendations around that. So that's investing in, walking, cycling, and public transport, and sort of trying to reduce the need for light-duty vehicle movements. But also, I think the policies in this space has been moving quite quickly in recent years. But I think, the chart that I showed earlier clearly shows that the government can put a finger on this stuff and move the dial quite a lot in terms of electric vehicle uptake. But I think I mean, a level playing field for and sort of a common cost for all light vehicles around their contribution to the roading network, so the RUCs, I think would be a good start.
Thank you. That was really interesting. One of the critical areas of action appears to be amendments to the ETS, and I guess what you really need to achieve there is a much higher price of carbon. Yeah, I know it's a very difficult political environment at the moment.
Yes.
What's the issue on what kind of changes to the ETS might achieve those outcomes?
I'm not in the ETS team, and so I don't feel I can answer this properly. But I think it's fair to say that we've made quite a few recommendations around, focusing the ETS on reducing gross emissions as opposed to net emissions, and making sure that it's I'm gonna muck this up if I talk too much about it. So making sure I think rebalancing the ETS so it drives emissions reductions, I think is fair to say, but I don't want to talk about specific policies.
Thank you very much. Louis Brown, Dunedin Airport. Lovely to have another graduate from Otago back here. It's wonderful. ETS, natives. I understand there's a few different groups around government looking at that, and some people outside of government too. Just wondering whether the Climate Change Commission, I guess, has a position or a view as to whether we might support natives within the ETS, or we might portion that off and support a new voluntary scheme.
Another ETS question. What I do know is that in our modeled pathways and we are doing, we think there's scope to do a lot of native, expand natives a lot, and there's a lot of co-benefits there. I wouldn't comment on sort of what the government should do or not do about the ETS on that.
Yeah, nice. I guess it's fascinating to me with at the moment where you've got arguably left and right supporting with Mike Buttrick from the Wairarapa, who's a national MP there, and obviously the left supporting that, and I guess there's just such a big pushback on just PRAD, Pinus Radiata, on private landers, and the government's already made protections against some of that. So I guess even any predictions on where that might be heading.
I mean,
again, sorry, it's
there's definitely clear co-benefits from planting natives.
Hi there, I'm Ben Littlejohn, also from the Sustainable Energy Research Group at University of Canterbury. With the recent government attention to targeting growth as a central aspect of their governance strategy, has the Climate Commission accounted for that in terms of the emissions targets, and how does that interact with your models, especially in industries that such as dairy, which would be expected to lift a fair bit of the weight whilst also being one of the highest emitting factors?
Yeah, great. So our task is to think about climate change, and we try not to get into how the economy beyond that should be shaped. So we generally are sort of, when looking at economic growth, for example, we just take whatever the latest government projections are, what they're using in their policy scenarios, that kind of thing, and just use them and interrogate them to a certain degree. Like, would run sensitivities on how growth might affect emissions, but we try not to get too deep into like talking about particular industrial production or sectors. So for instance, in the dairy sector, we would just take the government's milk production kind of projections and say, this is what we have to, this is our task. We need to reduce emissions from this to demand driver, essentially. And that's because our advice is to government, and we're trying to be useful, trying to show them what the potential is based on their kind of outlook for the economy.
Yeah, hi Hugh, thanks for an interesting presentation. It's Solis Norton with Whitika Consulting in Dunedin. Your cascade work, was there a couple of nuggets that you could pick out from there that were really important upfront pieces that needed to be looked after, or a focus to conserve to ensure that the cascading effects didn't result?
Yeah. I think the thing that struck me is just how, particularly for infrastructure networks, just how interdependent everything is. You see, and maybe this is, but that electricity supply is so fundamental to a lot of other infrastructure, and so kind of getting kind of the coordination on some of that stuff right seems like really important. And then there's a whole other, there's a lot of other kind of loops in there, and to be honest, I haven't really dug into that work yet. So this is sort of just emerged out of the workshops that we ran for it. So yeah, but also that how infrastructure service quality, there's this loop where you see, there's a sort of a expectation loop where you see infrastructure service degrade, which means that people are less, become less dependent on it, and might, abandon. So if it becomes too costly or expensive, they might leave the network, that kind of thing, which drives costs. For the point of that there being is it drives costs for the people that can't afford to get off, and so you have the spiraling costs for the people that are least able to escape. So things like that are really important. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Natural gas would be a good example of that.
Yeah. I was just thinking that, that's like the death spiral loop. Yeah. Classic network death spiral. Yes.
Any other questions? So I just have a quick question for you, Hugh. In one of your slides where you were showing kind of, I guess, the various risks and where they lay, you had high frequency, high impact events, but you didn't have low frequency, high impact events.
Oh yeah, we do have that, and we did consider that. It's just that was trying to really distill things down to fit on that slide, basically.
Good morning, thank you. I just have a quick question. Thank you for highlighting the negative externalities about not meeting the emissions reduction budgets. Would it be fair to say that, no matter how well we as a country track towards meeting these budgets, that we should prepare for climate change impacts nonetheless, in case other countries do not meet their individual budgets and we face the consequences anyway?
Yeah, I think, absolutely. We do have influence on the world, and achieving these targets is it's a useful and kind of, it does move the needle, but we have to prepare for, a whole range of scenarios, right? Like, we can't influence the whole world